Bismillah, alhamdulillah, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all of you. So in an earlier video, I was talking about the two different types of motivation, or two different categories of motivation, being extrinsic, something outside yourself, and intrinsic, something internal to yourself, meaning your own reasoning, and how extrinsic motivation can be positive or negative. Positive being some sort of reward, negative being some sort of punishment. Now, in the management and motivation of children, to say in the Western world traditionally has been very, very punitive and focused on negative extrinsic motivations. So for most of the history of the education system in the West and in Britain, the base of the motivation system and behavior management system of the kids would be the teacher holding a stick in the front of the classroom, and they might use it as a pointer on the chalkboard, but it'd serve a dual role because they'd also use it to hit the kids. Now, motivational tools, have criticisms of extrinsic motivation. That doesn't mean that they don't have a place and use sometimes, because they're tools, and sometimes you need to use them. Other times they can be used tactically. But when they form the base, of what you're using to motivate kids and to get them to practice the behaviors you want, the consequences can be very negative. And it's just much less likely that it will inculcate long-term behavior in them that you want and long-term habits in them that you want. And it's much more likely that when children have only been nurtured on extrinsic motivators, that along the path in their development into an adult, they will have some sort of backlash towards the things they were taught growing up, because the intrinsic motivation was never nurtured. So, only using corporal punishment to motivate kids, that traumatizes people, and it makes kids operate in a way where, their compliance is only based on fear and anxiety. So, the West got to a point where generations had decided they didn't want the succeeding generations to grow up with that, because they wanted to change, because they could reflect on their own experience, and they didn't like being in schooling like that or having parents who raised them like that. So this has gone on for maybe like 50 years, where the West has moved away from using that particular tool as a motivation for kids. Now, in replacing it, what's been settled on isn't anything having to do with intrinsic motivation. It's just been positive extrinsic motivation. So we see this in our schools today, particularly in the behavior management method that is known as PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Systems. And this is something that schools will show off about doing. You can go to their website, they'll have their whole PBIS system out, showing off about it. Now, PBIS, it's not just one thing, but it is based on motivating positive, modeling for kids positive behavior, and then giving them extrinsic rewards for doing it. So they get little tickets that say they did a good job. They might get a certificate saying they did something good. Again, more recess play, more class parties, sometimes little toys they can choose from, little marble counters, sometimes candy, things like this. So this, it is something preferable to just hitting kids that was done in these societies before. But there's still a lot of problems with this type of motivation. Now, this type of motivation and using it is what is usually called classical conditioning or operant conditioning in psychology. And it is entirely based off of the work of a 19th century psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. If you've taken Psychology 101, you've heard of him. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who was studying the digestive system of dogs. And he realized that when feeding a dog, they would begin to recognize the cues leading up to being fed, like the lab assistant who would come in to put the food in the bowl. That would start to get them excited. And he measured their saliva output, and he found that they would actually start to produce saliva just upon seeing those triggers leading up to being fed. And he tested this by feeding a dog constantly and ringing a metronome or a bell before feeding it, and he came to find that it would salivate just by hearing the sound or the bell. And he eventually took the food away and found that the metronome or the bell sound would continue to make the dog salivate, even if the food wasn't coming. And training of dogs still works under this. So you have a dog, you want to train it to sit, you tell it to sit. When it does, you give it a little treat. And you do that, and it begins to learn that if I sit, I get a treat. And eventually, so it's hearing sit as a cue to do the action, and it gets a reward. Now with dogs, eventually you can take the treat away, and it will still just sit when you tell it to sit, and it will never make the connection that the treat is not coming anymore. It's just been conditioned to respond to the cue. Now, with human beings and kids, they can operate this way and be conditioned this way to a degree. But the thing is, with kids, even very, very little kids, they eventually realize that the treat is not coming. So you can condition them to respond to a stimuli and produce an action because they know they're going to get a reward. But even very, very, very little kids are smarter than the dog to realize that if you take the reward away, it's not coming. And now my motivation for doing the action you wanted me to is gone. And this happens in schools all the time. You see it all the time with PBIS systems where, okay, you tell the class, if we behave all week, we don't have interruptions in class, we're going to have a party at the end of the week on Friday. They have a good week. They have the party at the end on Friday, and everything goes well. They come back Monday, and they're right back off the rails, interrupting and doing everything because the motivation is gone now. And then you got to bring the party back. So now all of a sudden you're having a party every Friday. And eventually the novelty and the stimulation of that party or whatever the war is wears off a little bit, and then the kids, they start wanting more, and they start wanting more. So this happens when only extrinsic motivation has been nurtured. Even like directly with the bell sound, there's schools who use that. They use like a little chime sound to signal to the kids to be quiet in class. And they begin to respond to it. But if you have a classroom where they're using that two classrooms where they're using that chime sound, and you have one classroom where the teacher is explaining the reasoning behind it and explaining to the students why it is good for them in a value-based way and in a long-term way as to why they should be compliant and sit and listen in class, that classroom, the response to the chime is likely to last. But in the other one where that type of explaining, the time for that is not being put in and not being done consistently and not being done in whole class ways as well as like individual ways for kids who need a little more explanation, in that class, the kids will begin to test the boundaries and make the system break. And you see this all the time. Now, Ivan Pavlov, when he was, after he did his work, which is all considered groundbreaking at the time, he won a Nobel Prize for it, he said that when he studies dogs and he learns something, he immediately applies it to humans because the basics are the same, is what he said about them. Now, of course, there's anatomical similarities between humans and dogs. They have the same organs, both have brains, all that type of stuff. But, and some of, for educators, some of this some of the psychology and even a lot of theories in education that are based in things from that time period, especially actually at the turn of the 20th century, some of that really needs to be re-examined because some of it's really based on stuff that should either be invalidated now, or if you look back onto it, it was people who were not, they were a little twisted in their thinking, to be honest. I'm not necessarily saying that was Pavlov, but, to take from it as a base that you can just condition humans the same way you can condition a dog is really a problem. And it's known now through brain scanning, which they didn't have available at the time, although they would examine the brains of carcasses. That's a whole different thing, but dead people. dead animals. But still, like, they can analyze what actually makes up the brain nowadays better than they could then. And it's well known now that the human brain is unique compared to pretty much every other animal's. There's things about it that are the same, but it has very unique features, especially its development and makeup of the prefrontal cortex. And most people know the prefrontal cortex is, it's the part of the brain that adolescents are really developing intensely and isn't fully developed till the mid-20s. And, it's the part of the brain that uses reasoning. It's the part of the brain where reason-based decision making it can take place. It's the part of the brain that is used to override impulse and override emotional reaction and emotion-based decision making. And it's the part of the brain where intrinsic motivation is nurtured. And that nurturing can even begin at young ages. And you want to be intentionally trying to nurture it at young ages, because the younger you start doing that, the sooner it is going to nurture. And our kids need a lot of help with this nowadays, because everything is using operant-like conditioning upon them and only conditioning them for extrinsic motivation. Now, again, going back to the consumption of media, it's entirely based on, short stimulation and short releases of dopamine, the likes, the red notifications, the visuals, all that type of stuff that conditions them to form the habit of, looking at the phone or whatever, not for any reason or value-based purpose or motivation, but for the motivation of instant stimulation. And as I've explained, and maybe people realize it, maybe they don't, but schools are doing this to kids constantly. They're relying on extrinsic motivation to get compliance from them and to motivate them to do what we want. And all this has the effect of not setting up kids to develop the type of habits that are associated with long-term success. And that's the overriding problem with it.